In a world constantly grappling with questions of growth, sustainability, and survival, one name echoes across centuries: Thomas Malthus. From his controversial population theory to his lasting influence on economics and environmental science, Malthus's ideas continue to provoke debate and inspire new ways of thinking. Whether you're a student of history, a lover of big ideas, or someone curious about how the past shapes our present, you're in the right place. Welcome to Words of Time, where we bring history's most fascinating thinkers to life. In this video, we'll dive deep into the life, theories, and legacy of Thomas Malthus, from his early influences and revolutionary writings to his lasting impact on modern science, economics, and environmental thought. Let's begin. Thomas Robert Malthus remains one of the most influential and controversial figures in the history of economic and demographic thought. Living through a time of rapid transformation in Britain and Europe, Malthus proposed ideas that challenged the optimistic and progressive assumptions of his age. His theory of population growth, as articulated in his seminal work, An Essay on the Principle of Population, has reverberated through disciplines as diverse as economics, sociology, environmental studies, and public policy. By arguing that population, if left unchecked, tends to increase faster than the means of subsistence, Malthus introduced a framework that emphasized limits, constraints, and the consequences of overpopulation. This essay aims to offer an in-depth exploration of Malthus's life, his theories, and the vast legacy he has left behind. While Malthus was a product of his time, his core insights continue to stir debate, provoke reflection, and inform policy discussions across the globe. His contributions were not limited to demographic theory. He also played a crucial role in shaping classical economic thought, engaging in rich intellectual debates with contemporaries like David Ricardo. This extensive account seeks to unpack his multifaceted legacy, starting from the socio-historical context in which he lived and moving through his intellectual development, key works, critiques, and the enduring significance of his ideas today. By delving into both the man and the mind, this work aims to provide a comprehensive understanding of Thomas Malthus's place in history and the lasting resonance of his ideas in the 21st century. The late 18th century was a period of dramatic upheaval and transition in Britain and across Europe. The Enlightenment had heralded a new age of reason, science, and optimism about human potential. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Kant championed ideals of liberty, rationality, and progress. Philosophical discussions about the perfectibility of man, the role of the state, and the nature of human society were at the forefront of intellectual life. Simultaneously, the Industrial Revolution was beginning to transform economies and societies. New technologies such as the steam engine and mechanized spinning equipment were revolutionizing production processes, dramatically increasing output, and altering the nature of labor. Rural populations were migrating to urban centers in search of employment, leading to rapid urbanization and significant changes in social structures. In this dynamic and often chaotic context, economic inequality, poverty, and social unrest became increasingly visible. The traditional agrarian economy, which had provided the economic base for most of Britain, was giving way to capitalist industrial production. This brought not only prosperity to some but also stark poverty to others. The pressures of urban crowding, lack of public sanitation, and unstable employment conditions highlighted the vulnerabilities of the new economic order. Political events further added to the sense of instability. The American Revolution and the French Revolution had profound impacts on political thought and governance. In Britain, these developments stirred fears of rebellion and radical change, prompting intellectuals and policymakers to reconsider the foundations of political and economic life. Within this climate, thinkers began to confront the implications of population growth. The dramatic changes in economic life were accompanied by increases in population, raising questions about sustainability and the capacity of society to support its members. Utopian thinkers like William Godwin and Condorcet envisioned a future of boundless human improvement, where science and rationality would overcome scarcity. Malthus emerged as a counterpoint to this optimism. He argued that such visions failed to account for the fundamental biological realities of human reproduction and resource limitation. His work can be seen as a reaction against the radical optimism of the Enlightenment and a sobering assessment of the natural constraints on human societies. Malthus's thinking was shaped not only by the intellectual currents of his time but also by the practical challenges facing a rapidly changing Britain. He sought to ground political and economic theory in empirical observation and logical analysis, offering a more cautious and, some would say, realistic view of human prospects. Understanding this historical context is essential to appreciating the motivations and implications of Malthus's work. His ideas did not emerge in a vacuum but were a response to the transformative forces of his age. Thomas Robert Malthus was born on February 13, 1766, at the Rookery, a country estate in Surrey, England. He was the sixth of 7 children born to Daniel Malthus and his wife, Henrietta. The Malthus family was affluent and intellectually engaged. Daniel Malthus was a gentleman scholar with connections to many of the leading thinkers of the time, including the philosopher David Hume and the political theorist Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He held progressive views and encouraged open-minded discussion within his household. This intellectual environment undoubtedly influenced young Thomas and provided a fertile ground for his future intellectual pursuits. Malthus received his early education at home under private tutors before enrolling at Jesus College, Cambridge in 1784. At Cambridge, he studied a range of subjects including Latin, Greek, mathematics, and theology. He was particularly influenced by the works of John Locke and Adam Smith, whose ideas on government, economics, and society would later inform his own thinking. Malthus graduated with honors in 1788 and was ordained as an Anglican curate in 1791. His religious training was significant in shaping his moral and philosophical outlook. He believed in the importance of moral responsibility, personal restraint, and the ethical dimensions of social policy. Even during his student years, Malthus was deeply concerned with the practical implications of philosophical and economic theories. He was skeptical of overly optimistic views of human nature and progress. His father's enthusiastic support for the utopian ideas of William Godwin provided an early intellectual challenge that helped shape Malthus's critical stance. This familial dialogue, grounded in both affection and intellectual rigor, was instrumental in motivating Malthus to write his first major work. His early experiences, both academic and personal, thus laid the foundation for his future career as a scholar and public intellectual. The synthesis of theological training, classical education, and exposure to contemporary debates equipped Malthus with a unique perspective that would distinguish his contributions from those of his contemporaries. The publication of An Essay on the Principle of Population, in 1798 marked a turning point in the intellectual history of economics and demography. Written anonymously at first, the essay was a direct response to the optimistic theories espoused by thinkers such as William Godwin and the Marquis de Condorcet. Both had proposed that human societies could achieve indefinite improvement through reason, science, and social reform. Malthus's father, a great admirer of Godwin, had often discussed these ideas with his son, prompting Malthus to develop a counter-argument grounded in empirical observation and logical reasoning. In the first edition of the essay, Malthus introduced the central premise that population, if unchecked, grows geometrically while the food supply grows only arithmetically. This imbalance, he argued, inevitably leads to a situation where the population exceeds the available resources, resulting in what he termed positive checks on population growth. These included famine, disease, and war, all of which served to reduce the population to sustainable levels. Malthus also introduced the concept of preventive checks, which encompassed moral restraint, delayed marriage, and celibacy, as voluntary means to curb population growth. He argued that these checks were necessary to avoid the suffering associated with positive checks. The essay was controversial from the outset. Its bleak outlook and apparent insensitivity to the suffering of the poor provoked strong reactions. Yet, it also gained attention for its rigorous logic and its challenge to prevailing assumptions. In 1803, Malthus published a second, greatly expanded edition of the essay under his own name. This version included more extensive empirical data, drawn from various countries, and refined many of his earlier arguments. He clarified his position on moral restraint and emphasized the importance of individual responsibility in managing population growth. The second edition also engaged more directly with his critics and addressed concerns about the social implications of his theories. Malthus's essay was groundbreaking in its methodological approach. He combined theoretical analysis with empirical observation, setting a standard for future work in economics and demography. His use of clear, accessible language and logical structure made his arguments compelling, even to those who disagreed with his conclusions. The essay also introduced a new way of thinking about societal development, one that emphasized the limits imposed by nature and the unintended consequences of well-meaning reforms. In doing so, Malthus laid the groundwork for future debates on sustainability, resource management, and social policy. Thomas Malthus's theory of population growth is one of the most significant and widely debated ideas in the history of economic and demographic thought. The core of his theory is built upon a fundamental tension between two natural forces, human reproduction and the availability of resources, particularly food. Malthus observed that while population has the potential to grow at a geometric rate, resources, particularly food production, tend to increase at an arithmetic rate. This imbalance, he argued, would inevitably lead to a situation in which the population exceeds the capacity of its environment to provide sustenance. As a result, unless checked by deliberate human action or natural constraints, population growth would lead to widespread poverty, famine, and social disorder. Malthus began by stating that the power of population is indefinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. In simpler terms, people can reproduce far more quickly than the earth can increase its supply of food. If each generation of people were to have only 2 or 3 children who survived to adulthood, the population would grow exponentially, doubling every few decades. Meanwhile, agricultural production could only increase by expanding the amount of land under cultivation or by improving farming methods, both of which have practical and technological limits. To explain how this imbalance would be resolved, Malthus introduced the concepts of positive checks and preventive checks. Positive checks are those that increase the death rate. They include famine, disease, war, and other calamities that reduce population size by increasing mortality. These checks are often harsh and devastating, leading to suffering and loss on a large scale. Malthus viewed these checks as nature's way of restoring balance when population growth outpaces food production. In his view, such checks were an inevitable outcome when societies failed to implement measures to limit population growth voluntarily. Preventive checks, on the other hand, are measures that reduce the birth rate. Malthus advocated for what he called moral restraint, a conscious decision to delay marriage and limit family size as a means of controlling population growth. He believed that individuals, particularly in the working classes, should exercise prudence and responsibility when considering whether they could support a family. This idea placed a strong emphasis on personal morality and discipline, reflecting Malthus's religious and ethical framework. Unlike positive checks, preventive checks could mitigate overpopulation without the accompanying human suffering, making them, in Malthus's view, the preferable solution. One of Malthus's more controversial arguments was his critique of social welfare programs and charitable relief. He contended that such measures, while well-intentioned, could actually exacerbate the problem of overpopulation by enabling more people to survive and reproduce without addressing the underlying imbalance between population and resources. By reducing the natural hardships that acted as checks on population growth, these policies could lead to larger population sizes, which in turn would strain resources even further and increase overall suffering. This perspective sparked intense debate and was often criticized as callous or inhumane. Nevertheless, Malthus maintained that the long-term consequences of unchecked population growth necessitated a more pragmatic approach to social policy. Malthus also introduced the concept of the Malthusian trap, a condition in which population growth continually outstrips resource growth, keeping societies in a state of subsistence and preventing long-term improvements in living standards. According to this model, any increase in food production would initially lead to better conditions, but these improvements would soon be offset by population growth, bringing per capita resources back down to subsistence levels. This cycle would repeat itself unless population growth was checked by either preventive or positive means. The Malthusian trap was seen as a powerful explanatory model for the persistent poverty and stagnation observed in many pre-industrial societies. The implications of Malthus's theory were profound. It challenged the Enlightenment belief in human perfectibility and the idea that reason and science alone could lead to a utopian society. Instead, Malthus suggested that there were natural limits to human progress, and that these limits were rooted in biological and ecological realities. His work forced economists, policymakers, and social theorists to confront the possibility that poverty and hardship were not merely the result of poor governance or unequal distribution, but intrinsic features of human societies constrained by nature. While the Malthusian theory provided a stark and often grim view of human prospects, it also laid the groundwork for later developments in demographic theory and resource economics. Malthus's emphasis on the relationship between population dynamics and resource availability anticipated many of the concerns that would emerge in the 20th and 21st centuries, such as environmental degradation, food security, and sustainable development. His work sparked ongoing debates about the role of government, the ethics of population control, and the balance between human needs and environmental limits. Critics have pointed out that Malthus underestimated the potential for technological innovation to expand food production. The agricultural revolutions that followed his time, particularly the Green Revolution of the 20th century, demonstrated that human ingenuity could significantly increase the productivity of land and labor, thereby pushing back the limits envisioned by Malthus. Additionally, demographic transitions in industrialized countries characterized by declining birth and death rates showed that population growth could stabilize as societies developed economically and socially. Nevertheless, Malthusian theory continues to be relevant as a cautionary framework. It reminds us that growth, whether in population or in consumption, cannot proceed indefinitely without regard to environmental and resource constraints. The core insight that there is a fundamental relationship between human numbers and the carrying capacity of our environment remains a foundational concept in discussions of sustainability and global development. Malthusian theory offers a compelling model for understanding the dynamics of population growth and resource limitation. It challenges us to think critically about the assumptions underlying social and economic policy and to consider the long-term consequences of demographic trends. Whether embraced or contested, Malthus's ideas have become an enduring part of the intellectual landscape, influencing debates on poverty, development, and the future of human society. The demographic implications of Thomas Malthus's theory have resonated across centuries, influencing not just the study of population dynamics but also the way societies think about human reproduction, sustainability, and the management of resources. When Malthus proposed his ideas at the end of the 18th century, demographic science was still in its infancy. His assertion that population tends to grow faster than the food supply was revolutionary, providing a systematic and theoretical basis for understanding population trends. This insight would go on to shape the development of demography as a field, inspiring generations of scholars to investigate the interplay between human population and the environment. Malthus's model described a self-regulating system in which population growth is inherently limited by the availability of resources. This framework offered a compelling explanation for the persistent poverty and subsistence-level living conditions that characterized much of human history. According to Malthus, whenever living standards improved through increased food production or social reform, the population would respond by growing, thereby canceling out the gains. This cyclical process, where periods of prosperity were inevitably followed by hardship due to overpopulation, became central to what would later be termed the Malthusian demographic regime. This concept underscored the idea that population pressure is a fundamental force shaping human history. For much of the 19th century, Malthus's theory served as a dominant lens through which population growth was interpreted. Many countries, especially those undergoing industrialization, saw rapid population increases, seemingly confirming Malthus's predictions. Social reformers, economists, and politicians invoked Malthusian logic to argue for or against various policy proposals, including welfare reform, public health initiatives, and urban planning. In Britain, the Poor Laws were shaped by Malthusian concerns, as policymakers feared that aiding the poor without restraint would encourage overpopulation and dependency. In colonial settings, the theory was often used to rationalize population control measures and to argue against efforts to improve living conditions among colonized peoples. However, the demographic realities of the 19th and 20th centuries also revealed complexities and contradictions in Malthus's model. While some regions did experience the kinds of positive checks Malthus described, such as famine and epidemic disease, other areas began to diverge from the expected patterns. The most significant challenge to Malthusian theory came with the onset of the demographic transition, a model developed in the 20th century that described how population growth tends to slow as societies industrialize and become wealthier. In contrast to Malthus's expectation of continued exponential growth, many countries exhibited declining birth and death rates as they advanced economically and socially. This shift suggested that human populations could stabilize or even decline without the need for positive checks, provided that certain socioeconomic conditions were met. The demographic transition model identifies 4 stages: high birth and death rates in pre-industrial societies, declining death rates during early industrialization, declining birth rates during mature industrialization, and stabilized low birth and death rates in post-industrial societies. This framework challenged the inevitability of the Malthusian trap and offered a more optimistic outlook. It suggested that improvements in healthcare, education, and economic opportunity, especially for women, could lead to voluntary fertility decline and sustainable population levels. While Malthus recognized the role of preventive checks, he underestimated the extent to which social development could alter reproductive behavior. Despite these challenges, the core concerns raised by Malthus have remained relevant, particularly in the context of global inequality and environmental degradation. In many developing countries, rapid population growth continues to strain resources, infrastructure, and ecosystems. High fertility rates, coupled with limited economic opportunities and fragile governance, create conditions reminiscent of the Malthusian scenario. In such contexts, Malthus's warnings about the consequences of unchecked population growth still carry weight. His emphasis on the balance between population and resources serves as a critical reminder of the importance of sustainable development. Modern interpretations of Malthus have also evolved, incorporating insights from ecology, systems theory, and global development studies. Neo-Malthusian thinkers such as Paul Ehrlich in the 20th century revived concerns about overpopulation in light of environmental limits and finite natural resources. The publication of The Population Bomb in 1968 echoed Malthusian anxieties and warned of impending disaster if population growth were not curbed. Although some of the more dire predictions did not materialize, the underlying premise that population dynamics interact with environmental constraints has remained central to discussions on climate change, food security, and biodiversity loss. Furthermore, Malthusian concepts have been adapted to new demographic concerns, including aging populations and declining fertility in developed nations. While Malthus focused on the dangers of excess population, today's demographers also grapple with the implications of population shrinkage and its effects on labor markets, social welfare systems, and economic growth. This shift in focus illustrates the flexibility and enduring relevance of Malthusian thought, even as the specific challenges faced by societies have changed. In educational settings, Malthus's ideas continue to form a foundational part of demographic curricula. Students learn about the historical context of his theory, its core principles, and its influence on subsequent demographic models. By studying Malthus, they gain insight into the ways in which human populations interact with their environments and the ethical, political, and economic questions that arise from this relationship. His work encourages critical thinking about the assumptions underlying policy decisions and the trade-offs involved in promoting human welfare. The demographic impact and interpretation of Malthus's theory have been both profound and multifaceted. While his predictions have not always been borne out, his analytical framework has provided a powerful lens through which to understand population dynamics. His emphasis on the limits imposed by nature and the potential consequences of ignoring those limits remains a vital part of contemporary debates. Whether one sees him as a prophet of doom or a realist ahead of his time, Malthus's contributions to demographic thought continue to shape how we understand the relationship between human beings and the world they inhabit. Thomas Malthus's contributions to economic thought extended well beyond his population theory. While he is best known for his arguments concerning the relationship between population growth and food supply, his economic writings reveal a thinker deeply engaged with the core issues of production, distribution, value, and economic cycles. In fact, his work significantly influenced the development of classical economics and helped shape debates that continue to animate economic theory to this day. One of Malthus's central concerns in economics was the issue of demand. He argued that the effective demand for goods and services played a vital role in sustaining economic growth and preventing depressions. This position put him at odds with other classical economists, most notably David Ricardo and Jean-Baptiste Say. Say's law, which posited that supply creates its own demand, held that production inherently generates the income necessary to purchase what is produced. Malthus, however, challenged this notion by arguing that under certain conditions, production could outpace consumption, leading to gluts or general overproduction. In such situations, businesses would struggle to sell their goods, leading to reduced production, unemployment, and economic stagnation. Malthus's emphasis on demand foreshadowed later developments in macroeconomic theory, particularly those associated with John Maynard Keynes in the 20th century. Keynes, who sought to understand and mitigate the causes of economic downturns like the Great Depression, drew on Malthusian ideas to argue that insufficient aggregate demand could result in prolonged economic slumps. Both economists stressed the importance of effective demand, the willingness and ability of consumers to purchase goods and services as a driver of economic activity. For this reason, Malthus is sometimes considered a precursor to Keynesian economics. Malthus was also interested in the role of savings and investment in economic development. He acknowledged that saving was important for capital accumulation, but he warned that excessive saving, if not matched by investment in productive activities, could reduce overall demand. If too many individuals hoarded their income or invested it in non-productive ventures, the economy could suffer from underconsumption. This analysis once again diverged from the optimistic views of other classical economists who saw saving as an unqualified good. Malthus recognized that economic equilibrium depended not just on production but also on the effective circulation of income within the economy. Another notable area of Malthus's economic work concerned the distribution of wealth among different classes in society. In his view, the economy was composed of landlords, capitalists, and laborers, each playing distinct roles. Landlords received rent, capitalists earned profits, and laborers were paid wages. Malthus believed that landlords played a particularly important role in sustaining demand, as their consumption patterns helped absorb the surplus output of the economy. He was less sanguine about the behavior of capitalists, whose inclination to save rather than spend could dampen economic activity. In this context, Malthus advocated for a distribution of income that would support consumption and, by extension, economic stability. In his magnum opus, Principles of Political Economy, Malthus elaborated on these themes, challenging the assumptions of his contemporaries and attempting to provide a more balanced view of economic processes. While his work was not immediately as influential as Ricardo's, it offered a vital counterpoint and helped broaden the scope of economic inquiry. Over time, many of Malthus's ideas gained renewed attention, particularly during periods of economic crisis when the limitations of classical models became more apparent. Malthus also addressed issues of labor and wages. He was skeptical of efforts to raise wages through legislation, arguing that such measures could be counterproductive if they led to increased population growth without corresponding increases in productivity. This position reflected his broader concern with the balance between population and resources. While Malthus recognized the hardships faced by laborers, he believed that sustainable improvements in living standards required structural changes in economic and demographic behavior, rather than temporary fixes. His views on poor relief also intersected with his economic thinking. Malthus argued that indiscriminate charity could reduce the incentives for work and self-reliance, thereby undermining economic productivity. He favored a more targeted approach that encouraged moral restraint and personal responsibility. Though controversial, these ideas contributed to important debates about the role of the state, the nature of poverty, and the appropriate design of social welfare systems. Despite the criticisms he faced during his lifetime, Malthus's contributions to economics laid the groundwork for subsequent developments in both theory and policy. His insistence on the importance of demand, his nuanced analysis of savings and consumption, and his focus on class dynamics all contributed to a more comprehensive understanding of economic behavior. While he is often overshadowed by figures like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and later Karl Marx, Malthus deserves recognition as a pioneering thinker who anticipated many of the challenges and debates that would define modern economics. In the contemporary era, Malthus's economic insights continue to inform discussions about fiscal policy, income distribution, and economic resilience. His skepticism of unbounded growth and his attention to the potential for systemic imbalances resonate in debates about austerity, inequality, and sustainable development. Economists today grapple with many of the same issues that concerned Malthus: how to ensure stable demand, how to manage the distribution of wealth, and how to balance individual incentives with collective well-being. Malthus's economic thought represents a critical dimension of his intellectual legacy. Far from being a one-dimensional theorist of population doom, he was a sophisticated analyst of economic systems, deeply attuned to the complex interactions between population dynamics, resource allocation, and macroeconomic stability. His work challenges us to consider the broader social and economic structures that underpin prosperity and to recognize the limits of simplistic models in a complex and interdependent world. Thomas Malthus's intellectual influence extended beyond economics and demographics into the realm of biological science, particularly through his profound impact on Charles Darwin and the development of evolutionary theory. Although Malthus himself was primarily concerned with human society, his ideas about the natural consequences of population pressure and the struggle for limited resources offered a powerful framework that Darwin adapted to explain the dynamics of the natural world. The convergence of Malthusian thought with Darwinian biology marked a pivotal moment in the history of science, bridging social science with natural science and reshaping humanity's understanding of life and its origins. When Charles Darwin read Malthus's An Essay on the Principle of Population, he was struck by the clarity and force of its logic. In his autobiography, Darwin recalled that the essay provided the critical insight that led to his theory of natural selection. Malthus's assertion that population growth tends to outstrip food supply unless checked by famine, disease, or other limitations resonated with Darwin's observations of nature. He realized that in the natural world, more individuals are born than can survive, creating a constant competition for resources. This struggle for existence, as Darwin termed it, became a foundational concept in his evolutionary framework. The key Malthusian principle that influenced Darwin was the idea that not all individuals can survive and reproduce in a context of limited resources. This principle implied a selective process in which only the fittest or most adapted individuals would endure and pass on their traits to the next generation. Darwin saw this as the engine of evolutionary change, natural selection. In this process, advantageous variations among individuals would increase their chances of survival and reproduction, leading to the gradual adaptation of species over time. Malthus, of course, had applied his reasoning to human societies, warning of the social consequences of unchecked growth. Darwin universalized the concept, applying it to all forms of life and transforming it into a biological law. In this way, Malthus can be credited as an indirect but critical contributor to the development of evolutionary biology. His work provided Darwin and his contemporary Alfred Russel Wallace with the theoretical underpinning for a mechanism of evolution that did not rely on divine intervention or fixed species. Instead, it emphasized environmental pressures and competition as natural forces shaping the diversity of life. This was a radical departure from previous biological theories, which often relied on static classifications and the notion of immutable species. Malthus's bleak but clear-eyed view of population dynamics helped liberate biology from theological constraints and grounded it in observable, material processes. The influence of Malthus on Darwin also highlights the interdisciplinary nature of scientific progress. Ideas from economics and sociology spilled over into biology, creating a synthesis that profoundly altered the intellectual landscape. This convergence illustrates how insights in one domain can catalyze breakthroughs in another, especially when they address universal questions such as survival, adaptation, and competition. Malthus's work, though not scientific in the modern sense, possessed the analytical rigor and empirical grounding that made it a valuable resource for thinkers like Darwin who sought to understand complex systems. Darwin's use of Malthusian principles also had implications for how evolutionary theory was received and interpreted. The notion of a struggle for existence, with its emphasis on competition and scarcity, aligned with the broader Victorian worldview that saw nature as harsh, unforgiving, and driven by self-interest. It echoed the emerging capitalist ethos of the time, in which economic survival depended on one's ability to compete effectively. In this context, Darwin's theory was not only a scientific breakthrough but also a reflection of contemporary social and economic ideas, many of which were shaped by Malthus. However, this association also led to some problematic interpretations of Darwin's work, particularly in the form of social Darwinism. Thinkers such as Herbert Spencer and others extrapolated Darwinian ideas, themselves rooted in Malthusian logic, to justify social hierarchies, imperialism, and inequality. They argued that the struggle for survival in human society validated the dominance of the fittest groups and the marginalization of the weak. While Darwin himself did not endorse such views, the Malthusian roots of his theory made it susceptible to co-optation by those seeking to apply biological determinism to social policy. It is important to distinguish between Malthus's original intent and the later uses of his ideas. Malthus was primarily concerned with the consequences of overpopulation for human welfare. He advocated for preventive checks such as moral restraint and warned against unbridled growth. His aim was not to justify inequality but to highlight the challenges of sustaining human life within ecological limits. Nonetheless, the universality of his arguments allowed them to be adapted, for better or worse, to a wide range of disciplines and ideologies. In scientific terms, Malthus's contribution to evolutionary theory is significant not because he provided a mechanism for change, but because he articulated the conditions that made such a mechanism necessary. Without the pressure of limited resources and the resulting competition, there would be no need for selection, no impetus for adaptation, and no driver of evolution. By identifying population pressure as a universal constraint, Malthus laid the conceptual groundwork for the most important idea in modern biology. Darwin's acknowledgement of Malthus also ensured that the essay on population would be read and studied by subsequent generations of biologists and naturalists. It became part of the intellectual toolkit for understanding ecological dynamics, species interactions, and environmental carrying capacity. In this way, Malthus's insights helped shape not only evolutionary biology but also the fields of ecology and conservation science, where the balance between population and resources remains a central concern. The relationship between Malthus and Darwin exemplifies how foundational ideas in one field can spark transformative insights in another. Malthus's analysis of human society, driven by the relentless arithmetic of population growth and the limitations of food supply, became the key to unlocking the mystery of evolution. Though he may not have envisioned this outcome, his work provided the essential stimulus for one of the greatest scientific revolutions in history. The legacy of this connection endures, reminding us that knowledge is often built through unexpected intersections and the creative application of enduring principles across domains. Throughout his life and in the centuries since his death, Thomas Malthus has faced extensive criticism from scholars, policymakers, and commentators across a wide spectrum of disciplines. His essay on the principle of population provoked strong reactions upon its publication, and the debates it sparked continue to this day. The criticisms leveled against Malthus reflect not only disagreements with his specific conclusions but also broader concerns about the assumptions, implications, and ethical dimensions of his theory. One of the earliest and most enduring criticisms of Malthus's theory came from those who believed he underestimated the potential for human innovation and technological advancement. His central argument that population grows geometrically while food production increases only arithmetically was seen by many as a flawed and overly pessimistic view. In the 2 centuries following Malthus's writings, food production has consistently outpaced population growth in many parts of the world, largely due to advancements in agricultural technology, transportation, and global trade. Critics argue that Malthus failed to anticipate the extent to which scientific progress would enhance human capacity to increase resource availability and manage population pressures. The Green Revolution of the mid-20th century, for example, saw dramatic increases in crop yields due to the introduction of high-yield varieties, chemical fertilizers, and modern irrigation techniques. These developments played a significant role in preventing the famines that Malthus predicted would be inevitable. While Malthus's framework provided a useful warning about the potential for imbalance, critics contend that his failure to foresee these innovations limited the applicability of his predictions. They argue that his model was static, failing to account for the dynamic nature of human ingenuity and adaptation. Another major criticism of Malthus concerns the moral and ethical implications of his ideas. His argument that poverty and suffering were natural and unavoidable outcomes of population growth was seen by some as a justification for social inequality and inaction. Critics accused him of being indifferent to the plight of the poor, particularly in his opposition to unrestricted charity and the poor laws. His belief that aiding the poor would only exacerbate population growth and deepen poverty led some to view him as callous or even misanthropic. This interpretation, whether fair or not, has colored perceptions of Malthus and contributed to the controversies surrounding his work. Progressive thinkers of the 19th and 20th centuries, including socialists and reformers, rejected Malthusian pessimism and instead emphasized the potential for social and economic transformation. Karl Marx, for instance, strongly criticized Malthus, arguing that poverty was not a result of population pressure but rather a consequence of capitalist exploitation. Marx believed that the structure of economic relations rather than natural laws determined the distribution of resources. From this perspective, Malthus's theory served to obscure the social causes of poverty and to naturalize inequality. Feminist scholars have also critiqued Malthusian thought, particularly in relation to reproductive rights and gender roles. Malthus emphasized moral restraint, especially delayed marriage and celibacy, as key to controlling population growth. This placed a disproportionate burden on women, framing them as the gatekeepers of demographic stability. Feminist critics argue that Malthusianism historically contributed to coercive population control policies and reinforced patriarchal structures that limited women's autonomy. They advocate instead for empowering women through education, healthcare, and economic opportunity, which have been shown to lead to voluntary reductions in fertility. Environmentalists, while often sympathetic to the core idea that there are limits to growth, have also challenged Malthus's assumptions. Some argue that his focus on population size overlooks the more critical factor of consumption patterns. For instance, the ecological footprint of an average person in a wealthy country far exceeds that of someone in a poorer country, even if the latter lives in a more densely populated area. Critics suggest that the environmental crisis is less about absolute numbers and more about how resources are used and distributed. This view shifts the conversation from sheer population control to sustainable development and equity. Modern demographers have highlighted empirical shortcomings in Malthus's theory. The demographic transition model, developed in the 20th century, provides a more nuanced understanding of population dynamics. It shows that as societies industrialize and become wealthier, birth and death rates both declines, leading to stable or even shrinking populations. This pattern contradicts Malthus's assumption that population will always tend to grow unless checked by hardship. It also emphasizes the role of social and economic development in shaping reproductive behavior, suggesting that policies promoting education, healthcare, and women's rights are more effective at managing population growth than Malthusian restraints. Furthermore, critics have pointed to the historical record to question Malthus's generalizations. While some regions have indeed experienced the kinds of famines and population collapses he described, others have managed to grow sustainably. The diversity of outcomes suggests that Malthus's model is too deterministic and does not account for cultural, political, and institutional factors that mediate the relationship between population and resources. The role of governance, technological diffusion, trade networks, and social organization all play significant roles in shaping demographic outcomes, complicating the neat logic of Malthusian theory. Critics have also challenged Malthus's binary classification of checks on population, dividing them into preventive, moral restraint, and positive, famine, disease, war. This dichotomy, while analytically useful, is overly simplistic. Modern population studies recognize a wide array of influences on fertility and mortality, including education, access to contraception, urbanization, economic opportunity, and cultural norms. By focusing narrowly on a limited set of variables, Malthus's framework misses the complexity and diversity of demographic experiences. Despite these criticisms, Malthus's work has not been entirely dismissed. Many scholars recognize that his central concern, the tension between population growth and resource availability, remains relevant. In fact, some argue that his warnings are even more pertinent in the context of climate change, biodiversity loss, and global inequality. While the specifics of his model may be outdated, the broader challenge of balancing human needs with environmental limits continues to inspire debate. Even his critics often concede that Malthus raised important questions that still deserve attention. The criticisms of Malthus reflect both the limitations of his theory and the evolving understanding of population and development. His work has been accused of being overly pessimistic, ethically problematic, and empirically flawed. Yet it has also been praised for its boldness, clarity, and foundational impact. The richness of the debate surrounding Malthus is a testament to the significance of his ideas. Whether viewed as a prophet of doom or a misguided alarmist, Malthus remains a central figure in the study of population, economics, and the environment. His critics have pushed the field forward, compelling scholars to refine, revise, and rethink the assumptions that shape our understanding of human society and its future. Thomas Malthus's legacy is far-reaching and multifaceted, extending across disciplines such as economics, demography, ecology, sociology, and even philosophy. Although he lived in the late 18th and 19th centuries, the issues he raised regarding population growth, resource scarcity, and the delicate balance between human activity and natural systems remain central to contemporary discourse. His enduring influence is evident not only in academic debates but also in public policy, international development, and environmental activism. Understanding the legacy of Malthus involves tracing the development of his ideas over time, exploring how they have been interpreted, challenged, and reimagined across various contexts. At the core of Malthus's legacy is his seminal contribution to population theory. His assertion that human population growth tends to outpace the means of subsistence introduced a new way of thinking about societal dynamics. Before Malthus, discussions about population were often framed in moral, theological, or purely political terms. Malthus brought a scientific and empirical perspective to the issue, emphasizing observable patterns and proposing a general principle that applied universally. This analytical shift helped lay the foundation for modern demography as a field of study. Even today, demographers reference Malthusian theory as a conceptual starting point when examining trends in fertility, mortality, and migration. In economics, Malthus's legacy is also significant, albeit complex. While his views were often overshadowed by more optimistic contemporaries like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, Malthus introduced key insights that would later gain traction, particularly during times of economic crisis. His emphasis on effective demand as a driver of economic activity anticipated later developments in Keynesian economics. During the Great Depression and subsequent economic downturns, economists and policymakers returned to Malthusian concerns about underconsumption and demand deficiencies. Malthus's observations about savings, investment, and class-based consumption patterns laid the groundwork for understanding macroeconomic stability and the role of fiscal policy. One of the most notable aspects of Malthus's legacy is his influence on Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution. Darwin credited Malthus's essay on the principle of population, as the catalyst that led him to develop the concept of natural selection. By applying Malthus's logic to the natural world, Darwin formulated a mechanism for evolutionary change based on competition for limited resources. This interdisciplinary link between social science and biology underscores the breadth of Malthus's impact and demonstrates how his ideas transcended their original context. The intellectual bridge between Malthus and Darwin remains a testament to the generative power of cross-disciplinary thinking. Malthus's ideas have also left a lasting mark on environmentalism and sustainability discourse. The central Malthusian concern that unchecked population growth could outstrip the planet's ability to support human life has been echoed in debates about resource depletion, ecological degradation, and climate change. In the 20th century, figures like Paul Ehrlich revived Malthusian arguments in works such as The Population Bomb, warning that exponential growth would lead to widespread famine and ecological collapse. Although some of these predictions proved overly alarmist, they succeeded in bringing attention to the finite nature of Earth's resources and the need for sustainable development. Malthus's legacy thus lives on in the ongoing search for balance between growth and conservation. In the field of public policy, Malthusian ideas have influenced debates over population control, family planning, and international aid. His arguments have been invoked both to justify and to challenge interventions aimed at limiting population growth. On one hand, proponents of population control have used Malthusian reasoning to support policies that promote contraceptive access, reproductive health, and fertility reduction, particularly in regions experiencing rapid demographic expansion. On the other hand, critics have warned that such policies can lead to coercion and human rights abuses, especially when driven by external actors or implemented without regard for cultural context. The ethical dilemmas associated with Malthusian policy applications continue to provoke heated debate. In academic and intellectual circles, Malthus's legacy is characterized by ongoing reinterpretation. Scholars have revisited his work in light of new data, changing paradigms, and emerging global challenges. The demographic transition theory, for instance, provides a counterpoint to Malthus's pessimistic predictions by showing that fertility and mortality rates decline with industrialization and development. Yet even within this framework, Malthusian concerns about resource limits and carrying capacity remain relevant. The rise of ecological economics, which seeks to integrate environmental and economic considerations, reflects a neo-Malthusian impulse to account for the material constraints of the biosphere in economic decision-making. Malthus has also become a cultural symbol, his name shorthand for a particular worldview that emphasizes scarcity, competition, and the limits of growth. This symbolic role is evident in the language of politics, media, and literature, where Malthusian is often used to describe scenarios of impending doom or harsh restraint. While sometimes used pejoratively, this label highlights the degree to which Malthus's ideas have permeated popular consciousness. Whether as a warning, a challenge, or a point of contention, Malthus remains a reference point in conversations about the human condition. At the same time, Malthus's legacy is not without its controversies. Critics have accused him of fatalism, elitism, and a lack of compassion. His opposition to poor relief and his belief that aiding the poor would exacerbate overpopulation have been particularly contentious. These criticisms have led some to question whether Malthus's ideas were not only empirically flawed but also morally problematic. Nonetheless, even his detractors often acknowledge the importance of engaging with his work, if only to challenge and refine it. The robust debate surrounding Malthus is part of what keeps his legacy alive. In education, Malthus continues to be taught across a variety of disciplines. In economics, he is studied alongside the other classical economists as part of the foundational canon. In demography and sociology, his theories provide a historical anchor for understanding population trends. In environmental studies, his warnings about the limits to growth serve as a starting point for exploring sustainability. This interdisciplinary relevance ensures that each new generation of students and scholars encounters Malthus's work, engaging with it in light of contemporary concerns and discoveries. Malthus's enduring relevance is perhaps best understood not as the accuracy of any one prediction, but as the persistence of the questions he raised. How can societies balance growth and sustainability? What are the limits of human ingenuity in overcoming natural constraints? How should wealth and resources be distributed to ensure equity and well-being? These are not merely historical questions, they are central to the challenges of the 21st century. In grappling with these issues, we are engaging, directly or indirectly, with the legacy of Malthus. Thomas Malthus's legacy is as complex as it is enduring. He was a pioneer of demographic thinking, a contributor to classical economics, a stimulus for evolutionary theory, and a touchstone for debates on environmental sustainability and public policy. His ideas have sparked controversy, inspired innovation, and shaped intellectual discourse across centuries. While his specific models may no longer be accepted in their original form, the broader themes of his work, scarcity, balance, and the interplay between human ambition and natural limits, continue to resonate. The legacy of Malthus is not a static monument but a living dialogue, continually evolving in response to the changing needs and aspirations of humanity. In the 21st century, the relevance of Thomas Malthus and his ideas continues to provoke debate, analysis, and reflection. Although his original theories were developed in the context of late 18th century England, many of the core issues he addressed, population growth, resource constraints, and sustainability, are more pertinent today than ever before. As the global population surpasses 8 billion and the world confronts escalating environmental challenges, Malthus's thinking provides a critical lens through which to evaluate modern dilemmas. Revisiting Malthus in a contemporary context reveals both the strengths and limitations of his arguments and illustrates how his legacy shapes discourse across a wide array of disciplines. One of the clearest examples of Malthusian thought in the modern era is found in discussions around global food security. Although agricultural technology has vastly improved since Malthus's time, concerns about food distribution, environmental degradation, and the limits of arable land persist. Globalization has interconnected food systems, allowing for the mass transport of agricultural goods across continents, but this has also increased dependence on fossil fuels and made supply chains vulnerable to political and climatic disruptions. The COVID-19 pandemic, wars, and trade disputes have all highlighted the fragility of global food networks. These developments underscore a key Malthusian insight, that human societies remain vulnerable to disruptions in resource availability, especially when those resources are stretched by growing populations. Malthus's ideas also resonate strongly in environmental science and ecological economics. The concept of carrying capacity, the maximum population size that an environment can sustainably support, is a modern elaboration of Malthusian thinking. Climate change, biodiversity loss, deforestation, and freshwater scarcity all raise questions about the long-term sustainability of current human activity. The Anthropocene epoch, characterized by the profound impact of human beings on Earth's geology and ecosystems, is often described in Malthusian terms. The idea that there are planetary boundaries which, if crossed, could lead to irreversible environmental damage, aligns closely with Malthus's warnings about the dangers of exceeding nature's limits. In particular, the concept of ecological overshoot, when human demand on natural ecosystems exceeds what the Earth can regenerate in a year, is deeply Malthusian in nature. Each year, the date known as Earth Overshoot Day marks the point at which humanity has used more resources than the planet can sustainably provide. This modern metric captures the same anxiety Malthus expressed about the long-term consequences of unchecked growth. As the global population continues to rise and consumption levels increase, especially in emerging economies, the tension between growth and sustainability becomes even more acute. Urbanization presents another area where Malthusian ideas retain relevance. As more people move into cities, urban planners and policymakers grapple with the challenges of housing, sanitation, infrastructure, and public health. Overcrowding, pollution, and resource strain in megacities mirror the kinds of pressures Malthus described, albeit in a different form. Cities like Lagos, Mumbai, and Dhaka face enormous stress on their basic services due to rapid population expansion. The failure to adequately plan for such growth often leads to slums, traffic congestion, and inadequate access to clean water and sanitation, conditions that echo Malthusian concerns about the limits of societal support systems. In contemporary debates about climate change, Malthusian themes frequently reappear, especially in discussions around mitigation and adaptation. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change (IPCC) regularly highlights the compounded risks posed by population growth and environmental degradation. Malthus's argument that natural limits can and will assert themselves resonates with fears of tipping points, where ecosystems collapse or become irreversibly damaged. While modern science has provided tools for measuring and modeling these processes with great precision, the underlying principle remains rooted in Malthus's warning: when human demands exceed the Earth's capacity, crisis ensues. Technological optimism continues to challenge Malthusian thinking, just as it did in the 19th century. Innovations in renewable energy, vertical farming, desalination, and biotechnology are heralded as solutions that could decouple human development from environmental degradation. Critics of Malthus argue that these advancements demonstrate humanity's ability to adapt and innovate in ways that defy deterministic predictions. Yet even the most advanced technologies require careful implementation and equitable distribution. The challenge is not only to develop new tools but also to ensure they are accessible, sustainable, and do not produce unintended consequences. This balancing act between technological progress and resource limits keeps the Malthusian framework relevant, even in high-tech discussions. Global inequality adds another layer of complexity to Malthusian analysis in the present day. Malthus focused largely on absolute population growth without considering the varying environmental impacts of different population groups. Today, it is widely recognized that consumption patterns differ dramatically across nations and income levels. A relatively small segment of the global population, primarily in wealthy, industrialized countries, accounts for a disproportionately large share of resource use and carbon emissions. This has led to critiques of Malthusianism as insufficiently attentive to the role of wealth, power, and systemic injustice in shaping environmental outcomes. Moreover, population growth is now concentrated in regions that are often the least responsible for environmental degradation but the most vulnerable to its effects. Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, has high fertility rates and is expected to experience significant demographic growth in the coming decades. At the same time, it faces severe challenges related to climate change, food insecurity, and underdevelopment. A simplistic application of Malthusian logic could stigmatize these regions and overlook the structural inequalities that drive both poverty and population dynamics. Modern Malthusian debates, therefore, must grapple with questions of justice, agency, and responsibility. The global health landscape also reflects Malthusian concerns, especially in the wake of pandemics such as COVID-19. Disease, which Malthus identified as a positive check on population, remains a potent force shaping demographic and social trends. The rapid spread of infectious diseases in a globalized world illustrates the vulnerabilities of dense populations and the importance of public health infrastructure. However, unlike in Malthus's time, modern medicine and global cooperation have dramatically improved the ability to respond to such crises. The tension between vulnerability and resilience continues to define the intersection of health and population. Family planning and reproductive rights remain contentious areas influenced by Malthusian legacies. Many international organizations promote voluntary family planning as a means to empower individuals, improve health outcomes, and support sustainable development. While these efforts often align with Malthus's emphasis on preventive checks, they are framed in the language of human rights and gender equality rather than moral restraint. This reflects a significant evolution from Malthus's original framework and highlights the importance of context, consent, and empowerment in population-related policies. In academia, Malthusian thought has evolved into various schools of neo-Malthusianism, which adapt and reinterpret his principles in light of contemporary evidence. These modern frameworks incorporate insights from systems theory, ecological economics, and complexity science to develop more nuanced models of population-environment interactions. While Malthus's original arithmetic geometric formulation may no longer be the standard, the essential concern about balance and sustainability remains central. Scholars continue to debate how best to achieve equilibrium between population growth and environmental capacity in an era defined by both unprecedented opportunity and unprecedented risk. Malthusian ideas are also reflected in cultural and philosophical discourse. Popular media often portrays dystopian futures characterized by overpopulation, resource scarcity, and ecological collapse. Films, novels, and documentaries echo Malthusian themes, serving as both cautionary tales and reflections of societal anxieties. These cultural representations keep Malthusian thinking alive in the public imagination, reminding audiences of the ever-present tension between human ambition and natural limits. Malthus's ideas remain deeply embedded in contemporary debates across a wide range of domains. His concerns about population and resources continue to resonate, even as the world changes in ways he could not have foreseen. Modern discussions incorporate greater complexity, acknowledging the roles of technology, inequality, policy, and ethics. Yet at their core they revisit the same essential questions. How many people can the Earth support? What kind of lives can they lead? And how can societies navigate the tension between growth and sustainability? In exploring these questions, we find that Malthus's voice, though centuries old, still speaks to the challenges of our time. Although writing in the context of late 18th century England, a time marked by revolutionary upheavals, economic transformation, and the early stages of industrialization, Malthus formulated theories and insights that have continued to shape discussions in economics, demography, environmental science, and public policy for over 2 centuries. The breadth and depth of his influence attest to the profound nature of his inquiries into the fundamental tensions between population growth and resource limitations. At the heart of Malthus's work lies a concern with the limits of human development and the conditions under which societies can flourish or falter. His seminal essay on the principle of population presented a simple yet powerful model. While population tends to grow geometrically, food production and other resources increase only arithmetically. This disparity, he argued, would inevitably lead to checks on population growth in the form of famine, disease, and conflict unless mitigated by moral restraint or societal intervention. Though this formulation has been challenged and revised over time, the underlying question it raises, how to balance human needs with the capacity of natural systems, remains unresolved and urgently relevant. Malthus's approach to social issues was notable for its empirical grounding and systematic reasoning. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he sought to derive social and economic principles from observable patterns and statistical evidence. This methodological rigor laid the groundwork for future developments in social science, particularly in the fields of economics and demography. His emphasis on scarcity, efficiency, and the dynamics of population provided a framework within which later thinkers could construct more nuanced and empirically sophisticated models. One of the more striking aspects of Malthus's legacy is the degree to which his theories have been appropriated, adapted, and critiqued by successive generations. In the 19th century, his ideas influenced the classical economists and played a role in shaping early political economy. In the 20th century, the rise of environmental consciousness and global development debates brought renewed attention to Malthusian concerns, especially as scientists and policymakers grappled with the implications of rapid population growth, resource depletion, and environmental degradation. In the 21st century, as humanity faces challenges such as climate change, pandemics, and global inequality, Malthus's insights continue to inform a wide array of discourses. Yet, Malthus has not been without his critics. Over the centuries, his perceived pessimism and policy prescriptions, especially his opposition to public assistance and his emphasis on self-restraint, have been seen by some as overly harsh or ethically questionable. His failure to anticipate the transformative impact of technological innovation on agricultural productivity and overall economic growth has led many to consider his predictions overly deterministic. Additionally, his focus on population growth, without adequately accounting for the unequal distribution of consumption and environmental impact, has limited the applicability of some of his conclusions in a modern, globalized context. Despite these critiques, Malthus's enduring value lies not in the literal accuracy of his predictions but in the analytical framework he provided. He forced scholars and policymakers to confront the relationship between human societies and the physical world they inhabit. He introduced concepts that would become cornerstones of ecological thinking: carrying capacity, sustainability, and systemic equilibrium. In this sense, Malthus was a precursor not only to modern economists and demographers but also to ecologists, sustainability experts, and systems theorists. Malthus's work also compels us to think ethically about the future. Questions about who bears responsibility for environmental degradation, how resources should be distributed, and what kind of societal structures are best equipped to deal with scarcity remain central to global debates. While Malthus himself may have emphasized moral restraint as a solution, contemporary approaches lean toward a broader set of responses including technological innovation, policy reform, education, and empowerment, especially of women and marginalized communities. In doing so, we are still engaging with Malthusian questions, albeit through different lenses. Malthus's emphasis on the unintended consequences of well-intentioned actions remains a vital reminder in policymaking today. His warnings about how aid to the poor might exacerbate population pressures have been hotly debated but also serve as early examples of systems thinking, recognizing that interventions in complex systems can produce counterintuitive and sometimes adverse results. This insight has become foundational in fields ranging from international development to environmental management. Malthus's intellectual honesty is also worth noting. He was not dogmatic but rather open to revising his views in light of new evidence. Throughout his career, he engaged seriously with critics and sought to refine his ideas. This commitment to inquiry over ideology is a model for scholars today, particularly in an age of polarized discourse and ideological entrenchment. Malthus invites us to approach complex problems with humility, analytical rigor, and a willingness to question assumptions. As we look toward the future, the The fundamental Malthusian challenge of how to live within limits while promoting human dignity and well-being continues to define our collective horizon. Advances in science and technology have expanded the realm of what is possible, but they have not eliminated the constraints imposed by ecological and social systems. The pursuit of sustainable development, equitable growth, and long-term resilience requires us to think in precisely the integrated, systemic ways that Malthus helped to pioneer. Thomas Malthus remains a figure of enduring significance not because all his ideas were correct, but because he asked questions that continue to matter. His work stands as a cornerstone in the edifice of modern social thought, a starting point for inquiry, a touchstone for debate, and a catalyst for critical reflection. In engaging with Malthus, we are reminded that the challenges of balancing population, resources, and human welfare are not merely historical curiosities but ongoing imperatives. As we navigate the uncertainties of the 21st century, Malthus's legacy invites us to think deeply, act wisely, and never lose sight of the delicate interdependence between humanity and the natural world.